Good afternoon. I am thrilled to welcome each of you to this special town hall. My name is Sherry Willis, and I am the founder and president of Alliance for Greater Works. Alliance for Greater Works is a 19-year-old intermediary organization with the mission of dismantling the root causes of injustices affecting marginalized communities. We accomplish our mission by creating awareness of a problem, as well as what we're doing today, as well as leadership and community development, training and technical assistance, and building cross-sector collaboratives. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who will be on Facebook or Twitter, use hashtag dismantling racial trauma. This is our fourth virtual webinar in our town hall series. And today's webinar focuses on dismantling racial trauma. The goal of this town hall conversation is to begin to shine a light on and dismantle the racial trauma people of color are experiencing so that we can have complete well-being. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the Hogg Foundation for Mental Health in the partnership with Alliance in this town hall meeting. We are grateful for your relationship and your investment in transforming how communities promote mental health and well-being in everyday life. According to Dr. Robert Carter, one of our panelists today, the term racial trauma is described as the physical and psychological symptoms that people of color often experience after being exposed to stressful experiences of racism. While I believe all people have experienced some level of trauma over the last 120 days with the COVID-19 and the racial distress in our country, the reality is that in the United States, people of color have experienced unimaginable stress and oppression over the last 400 years. Many of us witnessed on the video George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery being murdered. But what happens to the soul of a people when you are a citizen of a country that dehumanizes and oppresses you if you are not born white and male? For the next hour and a half, we will begin the conversation about historical trauma. We will not resolve everything in the next hour, but we want to ask you to join this historical journey with Alliance as we interrogate the history that has been erased from our public educational systems and many of our minds. We will be offering a series of conversations throughout the rest of 2020 that we believe will be beneficial and educational. Later, I will tell you how you may obtain a free additional resource that Alliance has created on this topic. Once again, even as we all contend with a global pandemic, the always present reality of racism has revealed itself through the senseless deaths of men and women of color. Racism is a public health crisis and has no place in our community, nor our country. Now, today's webinar is led by Alliance's Managing Director, Angela Johnson. A panel of experts are here to help us understand what we can do to support communities as they strive to dismantle racial trauma. Please note today, we are only using the Zoom video and audio features for our speakers. If you have a question for a panelist or the panelists in general, please use the chat function. For example, Ms. Rowe, after watching the news, I can't sleep at night. What can I do? Today, we have extended the conversation to many of our networks who are watching on Facebook Live. Welcome. If you have a question, please follow the same procedure, speaker's name, question, and if it is for the panelists in general, just the question. We are collecting your questions and we will get to as many questions as we can today. And with that, I turn it over to Angela.
Thank you, Sherry. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Angela Johnson, and I am really grateful for the opportunity to moderate our expert panel today. Our first panelist is Dr. Robert T. Carter. Dr. Carter is Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. He is an expert on the traumatic effects of racism. He has authored 120 articles and 9 books. His most recent books are Confronting Racism and Measuring the Effects of Racism. Both of those have been published this year. He is a fellow in the American Psychological Association and has several national awards. Thank you, Dr. Carter, for being with us today. Our next panelist is Dr. Jennifer Nez Denetdale. Dr. Denetdale is the first ever Dene Navajo to earn a PhD in history. She is a strong advocate for Native peoples and strives to foster academic excellence in the next generation of students interested in Indigenous studies. Dr. Denetdale is a professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. She is the author of Reclaiming Dene History, The Legacies of Navajo Chief Manuelita and Juanita, as well as The Long Walk, The Forced Navajo Exile. She is also the director of the University of New Mexico's Institute for American Indian Research and the chair of the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission. Thank you, Dr. Denetdale, for joining us. Dr. Christina Edmondson, our next panelist, has been blessed by an array of academic, professional, as well as lived experiences. Dr. Edmondson is committed to bringing diverse people together to promote personal and team flourishing. Currently, Dr. Edmondson serves as the Dean of Intercultural Student Development at Calvin University. Additionally, she is a certified cultural intelligence facilitator, public speaker, and mental health therapist. Dr. Edmondson consults about diversity and mental health issues. Her writings have been seen and referenced in a variety of outlets, including Essence.com, YourBlackWorld.com, and Gospel Today magazine. She is also one of the co-hosts of the Truth's Table podcast. Thank you, Dr. Edmondson, for being with us today. Sheila Wise Rowe, our last panelist, has a master's degree in counseling and is the executive director of the Rehoboth House, an international healing and reconciliation ministry. Ms. Sheila has over 25 years of experience as a Christian counselor, spiritual director, educator, writer, and speaker. Ms. Sheila is a member of the Redbud Writers Guild and writes essays for the Redbud Post. She co-authored with her husband, Dr. Nicholas Rowe, the book, The Well of Life, Heal Your Pain, Satisfy Your Thirst, Live Your Purpose. Her essay, Awaken to the Adventure, is in the anthology by Leslie Leyland Fields entitled The Wonder Years, 40 Women Over 40 on Aging, Faith, Beauty, and Strength. Ms. Sheila has also written a new book about racial trauma and healing from racial trauma, and it's entitled Healing Racial Trauma, The Road to Resilience. So again, thank you for being with us today. So since 2001, Alliance has been a resource for communities dealing with complex problems like racism, health, economic, and educational disparities. Today, we will have a courageous and a rather frank conversation about race in our nation's past as well as its present. And to provide historical context, we will show 3 videos throughout this town hall from when the first Africans arrived in Virginia 400 years ago to current issues faced by many African Americans and people of color today. I will admit that what we talk about today in the videos we will see may be disturbing. So I'm going to give you a second. If you don't want to watch or listen before each video, I will alert you so that you can walk away from your device. So you should walk away from your device now if you do not want to watch. Our goal in showing these videos is to provide some factual background, perspective, and framework for our conversation today. So let's start with the colonial era.
1619, 500,000 enslaved Africans had already made their way across the Atlantic, primarily to Brazil and Spanish colonies in South America and the Caribbean. So with that context, we see that slavery is not new, and we see that transatlantic slave trading is not new. That began in 1502. What is new about the 1619 Africans is that this is the beginning of a particular racialized slavery in what becomes English North America. For the 1619 Africans, what happens here is I think there's a realization that, oh, here we have a permanent labor force at our disposal. We don't have to release them after 4 to 7 years like they did the indentured servants. And in a labor-starved colony like Jamestown, I think people like Yardley and Piercy and other landholders see this as an opportunity. They don't necessarily speak the same language. The Africans they don't share the similar cultural context. They have no home country of England to appeal to for rights, to make claims of citizenship. And phenotypically, they look differently. They're easily marked out as a distinct labor class. And we see this in the labor categories of the early colony, where they're described as Negroes or servants not Christians, which was another way to describe them, to differentiate them in the records. So we have this combination of class and race coming together to create caste, a dynamic that presumes a permanent inferior group of people. And this is where we get the development of racial slavery. This is why Jamestown is so important for North American history. It's not that slavery was new, right? But it's this particular form of racial slavery that develops and what becomes America, that creates that racial caste system and ideologies of white supremacy and Black inferiority.
My name is Fountain Hughes. I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson. My grandfather was 115 years old when he died. And now I am 101 years old. Other people didn't have no beds when they were slaves. People slept on the floor. Tied here, tied there. Just like a lot of wild people. We didn't know nothing. Didn't like to look at no book.
So these concepts of white supremacy ideology and Black inferiority, let's drill down further into these definitions and complexities of racial and historical trauma. And I'd like to start with a question for our entire panel today. So how has our nation racialized slavery and colonialism informed where we are today as a nation? Dr. Edmondson, can you start us off?
Yes, I think I correctly unmuted that. So that's a really large question. And I think the best way to approach it is to talk about how we have pretended that we've not been impacted by the ways in which the United States became the United States. And so even before the narrative of the 1600s, we have indigenous people who are even today kind of perpetually ignored, perpetually invisible in our racialized narrative. And so there's so much of the American narrative, the American story, that relies on what psychologists might call strategic ignorance, strategic ignoring. There's so many pieces that are missing, which is why even when we talk about race and stratification in a candid way, people can become very anxious because they feel like there are segments of story that have been hidden from them, because there are segments of the story that have not been available to them. The way that this plays out today is that even if those stories have not been shared, and even if there's been a mythology given instead of the reality of the historical traumas, the pain and the ways that we have been shaped and misshaped by the historical trauma, that is still rather evident today, even if we don't have the education or understanding to know where it came from. So that's working out in the way that we live our lives and the way that we function today. So when we think about what it means for a people group, for example, when we think about the large number of people of European descent who came to what became the States for some sense of religious freedom or identity, who maintained a sense of religious piety while engaging in genocide and owning people, what it takes to manage that level of cognitive dissonance, the storytelling, the mythology that has to be created to maintain an identity of piety while subjugating other people, has created this very extensive narrative of white supremacy and Black and anti-Black inferiority, as well as indigenous invisibility and many other narratives in between as it relates to that stratification of people groups that we identify in race categories today. So that's how I would begin to answer that question, is that the way that it plays out today is that we're feeling the effects and we're living the realities of systemic racism that are a part of a story that is often hidden from us strategically, but instead what we get is a mythology that actually serves to re-traumatize us today.
Thank you. Dr. Denetdale, your thoughts?
I'm a historian, and so I'm always very important. It's always very important to understand historically the establishment of the United States as a nation. And I want to say that I am first a citizen of the Navajo Nation, and that indigenous nations that are within the United States are nations of people who predate the establishment of the United States, predate the appearance of any European who has come to this continent. And so that's always very important in terms of understanding these histories of colonialism and the ways in which we are racialized through these frameworks, and that we have commonalities in terms of how we are racialized and how we are the systems of oppression that exist, including the ways in which we've been racialized. And so for Indigenous people, we have always refused racialization, even though we get put into that framework. And so naming our places here as sovereign nations and sovereign peoples is very important in terms of the work that we all do together and as part of collaborative efforts.
Ms. Sheila.
Well, I would agree with what has been said already. I think the thing that I would add is around how over these centuries, these generations, what we've seen, whether it was the Black codes or with Jim Crow, there are messages that were given to Black folk, as well as other people of color, about our place in America, whether we are welcomed here. And I see that as something that has trickled down through the years, and we are experiencing that right now. We're in a moment where it is, the reality of that is being seen in video. And almost live, we're seeing the ramifications of what has been a legacy of exclusion and oppression and trauma. And so we're at a moment where we have to ask ourselves, what exactly does America want to be? Because I don't believe in the myth, the myths of American exceptionalism and, just pull yourself up by your bootstrap and the American value. And I think that partly worked for some folk, but not to Black and Indigenous and other people of color. And so I see what the past and the present kind of merging, and we're in this really pivotal crossroads where we need to just make some decisions collectively.
Thank you.
About how to go forward.
Dr. Carter, your thoughts?
My panelists have pointed out how groups have been understood and ignored or not acknowledged. I think it's important to understand how that's accomplished. And Ms. Wise just talked about the values of American society and culture are couched in terms of individualism and individual and personal responsibility. There's less emphasis in the cultural ethos on group behavior or group experience. Rather, it's couched in terms of individual responsibility. So the story goes that if people wanted to do better, then they can do better because we provide opportunity and access. And if they don't take advantage of that, then it's their fault. And there's less emphasis on the fact that there's a group or that we think of people in group terms. So that idea has been diminished, and we focus on individual characteristics and opinions and personal beliefs and attitudes. And there's a de-emphasis on understanding systems and groups and notions of that nature. And I think that has contributed from the colonial days to the present to us struggling with understanding what happens to people when they're part of a group.
Dr. Carter, that's really interesting, and I'd like to follow up with you on with another question. So could you just define for our audience these terms, race and racial identity? And are there any social implications? And if so, what are those implications?
Okay, so race is a social construct that uses physical features and skin color to identify a group. And what it does, basically from its origin in England, is it describes inbred characteristics and traits of group members that presumes that these traits and characteristics cannot change. So it's built on the idea of breeding animals to have certain characteristics and traits. Yet that idea doesn't have any social value. It's social, since there's no biological or genetic evidence to support the existence of distinct racial groups. So the way the notion works and what makes it a social construct is that it really reflects what people believe to be true of people designated to be members of a particular racial group. Let's be clear that racial groups are not just people of color. White is also a racial group, and there are ideas and beliefs about what's true about them and what their characteristics and traits are as well. So they're not excluded from the racial group category. Racial identity is something different, and I'm going to stop my answer at that point to the first part of your question and talk about racial identity and racism a little later.
Thank you, Dr. Carter, for that very clear explanation. Can't wait for the next part. Dr. Edmondson, we know that even well-intentioned people can be part of unconscious bias. Can you walk us through the definitions of unconscious bias, what it looks like, where does it show up, and can you give us some examples?
Sure. So implicit bias or unconscious bias, people in the field tend to use those words interchangeably, really has to do with the hidden biases that we hold about other people, for example. So we are all shaped by different narratives and schemas. So if I'm teaching my class and it's overwhelmingly students who are from the United States, and I start to do a countdown and I get to the numbers 5, 4, 3, 2, well, they know to say 1, right? Because they have a well-ingrained understanding of that schema. Well, schemas also work in a way that tells us how to feel and think about different people, whether we're given that information implicitly or explicitly. So if I grow up and I watch the local news and I always see a disproportionate amount of people of color as the people who are committing crimes over and over and over again, whether or not I have someone who blatantly tells me explicitly a narrative of Black criminality, I am still drinking from that kind of biased, racialized water fountain, and I'm still taking that information in. And it's shaping me, even though it may not match up with my stated convictions. So we have stated convictions, and they could be something like, you know, I love everybody, or I think everyone has value, or I don't judge people by their color, right? So you think about people saying these statements, but those are our stated convictions, and they often don't line up with our actual implicit or unconscious convictions. Those convictions convictions that we have, those unconscious biases, they tend to come out particularly when anxiety is up. So we go into that file folder with the biases that we have taken in implicitly and explicitly about people. We do that even more so when we're in a place where we feel a higher level of anxiety or fear. That's when we go into our bag of what we've been taught that we should think about other people, and we act out of it. So for example, if let's say you have a white woman who's on an elevator, and maybe her stated convictions is that she judges people by their character, she treats everyone the same, but then walks into that elevator an African-American male. And what she might find herself doing is grabbing her purse a bit tighter. She might, when driving through a neighborhood, she might find herself just all of a sudden, out of impulse, locking those car doors, right? So that's an expression of that implicit bias, which she would deny are her actual convictions, but it's coming out physically and behaviorally and the way that she's actually engaging people. We see this also in interviewing and hiring processes, right? So the questions that we might find ourselves asking one candidate versus completely ignoring those questions when talking to another candidate are oftentimes rooted in the biases that we hold about that particular group, which is one of the reasons why it's so important that hiring processes, that a whole host of practices have accountability as a part of them and are deeply managed and regulated to make sure that we are being equitable in our behavior towards different people, in light of the fact that if you have a brain, you have a bias. This is kind of how our brain works.
Thank you for that really rich explanation, Dr. Edmondson. I'd like to bring Ms. Sheila into this conversation. When we look at when we as a people, we often look for spiritual guidance in the pursuit of racial healing. So what does justice look like from a spiritual perspective?
Well, I think the reality of, if you are a spiritual person, that you're really recognizing that, you know, we are more than just physical beings, but we are spiritual beings as well. And so we have a connection with our Creator. And there are many ways in which that is supposed to play out. And so I'm going to speak from a Christian perspective, in that, you know, as a Christian, I have the belief that God is at work, even in ways that I can't see. And so I am listening for that. I'm watching for that. I'm reading the Bible for that. Scriptures that are highlighted for me are like Micah, which talks about, you know, the Lord has said what is good. You know, it's to do justice, to love kindness, and to humbly walk with God. And then Isaiah, to learn to do right, justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow. And so when I think about what does justice look like, we're in this place where, and I'm speaking from a Christian perspective, that what we're seeing is this battle, I think, over Christianity. And what is it? What is it that the Bible says about justice and about the oppressed? And what are we going to align with? Are we going to align with empire? Are we going to align inside with power? And as a Christian, that was the dynamic, obviously, you know, not obviously, but that was the dynamic when Jesus was here. And it was about, you know, do we side with Rome or not? And so there's a battle, I think, going on in terms of the soul of Christianity. And what does it mean to be just? What does it mean to actually love our neighbor as ourselves? And so that struggle is in the forefront of that. And so many churches are acting and really wrestling with that. And they're on the picket lines. They are serving in the midst of COVID. They are, you know, picketing. They are saying no and speaking truth to power. And then there is another wing of Christendom that is not doing that. And so what I would say is that, you know, we have models, whether it was the civil rights era, and that was birthed out of faith, people of faith coming together and really, you know, whether it's Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and his prophetically calling America to do right, to seek justice and to defend the oppressed. And this is the cry that we're hearing now. We're hearing it on the streets. And this is coming from people who are Christians and not, who are saying that this is it, enough is enough. And so when I think about what does justice look like, we have models throughout history of what that looks like. And whether it's Bonhoeffer in Germany, whether it's Dr. King, there are models to draw from.
Thank you, Ms. Sheila. So we'll keep that in mind. What does justice look like? Before we move on to Dr. Denetdale, I would like to share a short video on what happened to Native American children in the 19th and 20th centuries. And again, what you see or hear may be disturbing. So if you'd like to walk away, now's the time to walk away from your device. Let's watch.
Historically, the purpose of education for us as tribal people has been assimilation. When we go back to the boarding school era of the 19th and 20th centuries, the purpose then, along with churches, was to eradicate tribal culture, language, and traditions. The loss of language, the loss of culture, the loss of tradition, the loss of family, the loss of community. That brokenness is generational, and there's historical trauma attributed to it.
They took us away from our mom. They came marching right in and literally took us and thousands of other children from their home.
Sheriff Strider wanted an immediate burial because he knew that it wouldn't be good for the state of Mississippi for people to see what had happened to Emmett Till. And the only way you could stop people from seeing was to bury it. I mean, get it out of sight. I don't know what authority he had to bury my son, but he took that authority.
They're putting millions of dollars into building police stations inside of schools. So instead of putting resources towards things that make students feel better, and you put in police officers that make them feel like they're going to prison every time they wake up in the morning.
You got things like immigration pushing against you, police brutality. People really need to work on things as a whole.
I was at a Target, and right behind me a gentleman said, "Go back to your country, you need to learn English." Little did he know that I speak, English. I'm also a college graduate. It hurts because a part of me just wants to tell them, I wish you knew who I was.
Dr. Denetdale, can you describe for us or define for us what exactly is historical trauma, and specifically, how has it impacted people of color and specifically Native Americans?
So I'm going to take a definition from Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who coined the term historical trauma. And she says, historical trauma is the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation, following loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. And then she says how historical trauma gets passed down. It's no secret that many Native communities are facing serious difficulties: poverty, violence, poor health, suicide, unemployment, addiction, and hopelessness are widespread. And so these difficulties are symptoms of unresolved historical trauma. The concept of historical trauma attempts to convey how the effects of collective injuries such as genocide and discrimination can linger for generations. And the piece that you showed there gives some key points, and it does give a definition of historical trauma. And I want to say that there's been this huge shift in probably the last 20 years in terms of histories of boarding school education in Canada. It's called the residential school, and the abuses that were revealed about that. In the United States, is the boarding school experience for many Indigenous people. And so, they call that assimilation, but I think that the more appropriate term is genocidal practices and ethnic cleansing. And of course, in the present, what that points to specifically for myself as a Dene woman, as an Indigenous woman, is this sense of cultural loss, this sense of language loss. My parents went to boarding school. They were fluent speakers of our language. They did not expect their 5 children to speak our language. But my listening to them every day of my life speaking our language, and through the research that I did, the work that I did as a doctoral student, I now speak my language at a better than average conversational level. And I understand it like a fluent speaker. And so those are what we live with in terms of historical trauma.
Thank you, Dr. Denetdale. Dr. Carter, I'd like to return to you. Can you talk and give us some specific aspects of racism as it's related to psychological and emotional harm?
Yeah, first racism, or in the earlier question you asked me to define it, and I did not. I just talked about race. So racism, the way that most scholars use it, refers to the use of power by a group deemed superior, directed at a group deemed inferior, and it is enacted by individuals, organizations, institutions, and the group as a whole to deny access and opportunity and devalue members of the devalued group. When you use racism in that broad sense, it is difficult, if not impossible, to connect that experience of racism in the way that it operates in society to an individual's psychological and emotional reactions. It's hard to say that racism, broadly defined, has an effect on a particular individual in a particular set of circumstances. It is exceedingly difficult to indicate how lack of education that is targeted to every member of the group affects a particular person in the group. It may or it may not. So to understand the psychological and emotional impact of what we're calling racism, Alex Peterson and I have argued in the book on measuring the effects of racism, the importance of grouping classes of racism into more distinct categories that allows us to see the link between a person's racial encounter with that class of racism to his or her psychological and emotional reactions. So the categories or classes are hostile racism, avoidant racism, and aversive hostile racism. It's possible to take an encounter that reflects hostile racism and now ask an individual how was he or she affected by that encounter. And it's then possible to catalog or measure the types of reactions that he or she had and determine whether that reaction reflects a stress response, severe stress response, or traumatic response.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. That is very interesting. And as you describe the psychological and emotional harm, it makes me want to go back to Dr. Denetdale. So I'd like to come back to you, Dr. Denetdale. And could you chime in and give us your thoughts around human rights and historical trauma issues that COVID-19 has intensified for the Navajo Nation?
It just so happens that the Navajo Nation has submitted a report on the impact of COVID-19 on Indigenous people to Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And one of the things about human rights is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and it establishes the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous people. And so the Navajo Nation is submitting its report follows those standards for international human rights.
Ms. Sheila, what tools do you provide for those who want to move towards racial healing? What are the first steps? Who should be at the table? And how long should reconciliation take?
Yeah, that's a lot. You know what, I think the first piece is really having a sense of our stories, our histories, our personal experiences. And I know, part of my looking at my own life and doing research for the book is that there were all of these stories that families kind of kept hidden. And partly the connection was around, these are very traumatic incidents that occurred. And so there were families who were not disclosing that information. And yet there are ways in which growing up in a certain family, people were affected by that family history, as well as what they were experiencing on a daily basis. And so the first step is really having that sense of it. And one of the things that I use a genogram, which is something that I used with when I was involved with social work, but it gives you a good picture of your family over generations in terms of who are the members. And if you use it around trauma, being more specific, rather than just factual, but how have you seen it manifest in your family? Whether it's, overt racism, whether there was lynching, did you see addictions as a result of certain things? And so genograms can be helpful in that way, just a very concrete way, but even just listening to the stories and asking family members about what actually did happen. And these are ways of just really helping to identify the ways in which the effects of racism across the spectrum and has, whether it's historical all the way through interpersonal, microaggressions, gaslighting, how it's left wounds in our minds and our bodies and our spirits. And so that is what I would say is the start. And then the other piece would just be looking at how is it that I'm caring for myself in this current climate? This is an unprecedented period with COVID, with what is happening with the killing of men and women, Black men and women. There's so much trauma, vicarious trauma from watching videos. So how are we planning and to take care of ourselves? And that there are things that we need to look at on a spiritual level and emotional, relational, physical, and even in terms of our work. And there's an intentionality about it. And it's difficult because we're in the middle of a crisis. It's easy to shut down and to, some of the symptoms that we see in terms of a fogginess, the anxiety, fear tends to be heightened. We're struggling with grief. Communities of color, we've seen so many of our elders die. So we're grieving on top of feelings of rage and anger about what has happened. And it's really important to look at where can we get help to process that. And so whether that help is with a therapist, whether it's that you're connected to a faith community and that you can get some level of support there, that's really important. Thinking about social media, how much time do I really need to spend on it? And really being deliberate and intentional about that, because there are ways in which it can be re-traumatizing for so many of us. And then I think, just Black joy of we've got to have that balance of what is life-giving and affirming that is happening around us, that there is so much pain. And right now there's pain, there's death, but there's also life. And so I talk about subversive celebrations, and as a way of, we're going to celebrate in the face of this stuff as a counter, kind of a rebellious, an act of, no, I'm going to also celebrate life, even in the midst of this tragedy. And just physically, we've got to really think about how are we eating, because when we're stressed out, it's easy to just kind of pile it in as a way of medicating. and whether it's food or alcohol, we do it. And then movement. How are we releasing this pent-up energy and stress out of our bodies? That's absolutely essential. And so whether it's movement, whether it's some people who it's mindful practices, prayer, absolutely, as a way of, for me, of calming me down. And I've seen it with so many others. And then really looking at having a future, like a forward thinking, because it can feel like it is so dark and so difficult that this is it. This is the end of the story, when there's much more to life. And so what are the things that you're still dreaming of and hoping for? And getting support. Relationships are absolutely essential, and communities. Where are those communities where you can get together with other, Black and Indigenous people of color, where there's support? You don't have to explain stuff. You don't have to justify. You don't have the white gaze looking over your shoulder. Those are really essential in this period of time. So I want to
Those are some great tips. Dr. Edmondson, in your opinion, where does one begin in the pursuit of racial justice and accountability?
I think it begins first with an acknowledgement of really the brokenness, the historical narrative, the present day injustices. But I don't think you necessarily have to have a PhD in sociology or history to be able to know that something is wrong. So I say that to people who are not in academic spaces, that there are people who may not have advanced educational attainment, but they have wisdom, and they know that something is broken. And we can continue to look to individuals like that as well. When I think about historical figures like Fannie Lou Hamer and so many others who may not have had the textbook credentials, which are a blessing and incredibly important as well, but who had the wisdom of conviction and experience and led both locally and nationally and politically towards the efforts of justice. And so I say that to say, I don't want people to count themselves out because they don't have all the language together and they don't understand all the mechanics. With what you have, you do what you can. And so I want to encourage people to continue to learn. From a local standpoint, we're talking about anti-racism specifically. I would ask people to examine their lives, their practices, the institutions that they're affiliated with, and to do their own kind of auditing practice. So where I work, where I live, what is the story of the land that my home is on? Who was here before me? What is the story of the place where I work? How is it funded? And what are the practices that organization, that institution engages in that are racist or anti-racist? And by that I mean, in what ways do they have practices that are promoting equity and flourishing and acknowledging the intrinsic dignity of people? And in what way do they have practices that are not doing that, which would be racist practices? I think when we start to use that language without thinking of it as a slur, but thinking of it very practically, to what extent are the practices and policies racist or anti-racist? Ibram Kendi does a good job of laying this out in his book about how to be an anti-racist. But even before his work, this sense of thinking about what are the practices that promote flourishing, what are the practices that acknowledge intrinsic human dignity between people, and being intentional about seeing those happen in our faith communities, in our political communities, wherever we might be. So I would say that's where we start. We start with where we are situated, and we start with the natural resources that we have. I would challenge each person to think about what it means to be justice seeking in whatever your unique vocation is. And so if you're in the healthcare industry, if you're in the education industry, if you are a stay-at-home parent, wherever you may find yourself, you're in the armed services, wherever you may find yourself, be thinking about what does it look like to be an agent of equity and justice in this space. And that's going to require you to find allies to do that work, other people who are likewise interested and passionate about those topics. And it's going to require continued learning and continued education in order to grow. But there are people throughout history and all over the country right now in the United States who are deeply invested in action-oriented justice and doing justice. You know, Sheila lifted up the Micah passage about doing justice, and I am particularly connected to that passage because of my own faith tradition. But this idea that justice is not just theorized, justice is not just written about. Although philosophy is incredibly important and the analytical elements are incredibly important, but justice is actually done. It is built. It requires dismantling and building new things. And so thinking about our acts of justice as verbs, as tangible, I think is also another way to help us to make progress.
Very good. Jenny, Alliance's WRC program manager, has been collecting or curating your questions. So Jenny, can you share a few of the audience's questions with our panel?
Yes. This specific question is directed towards Ms. Sheila and Dr. Edmondson, particularly in light of that scripture in Micah that tells us to live justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. An individual is looking specifically as a believer, ideas on how to trust God, but also how to do that when you see the injustices.
Ms. Sheila, you want to take a stab at that first?
Yes. Wow. You know what? It is a hard reality of walking in like the now and the not yet. Like, you know, we have this faith in that God is at work and he's doing something. And yet we're looking at the realities of where we're at right now. And so how do we continue to do that, to hold that tension, and to pray about that which we don't see? It requires a long road, a long walk, and a commitment. But it also, I believe that what sustains us is not just like some kind of a, you know, this is invisible faith, but where has God worked? Where have we seen him at work? As confirmation, reminding ourselves of that reality, confirmation that he has been at work, he is at work, and that there, as bad as things are right now, things really were horrible and were even worse when we were enslaved. And this is not to equate that with we are fine and we've arrived. We certainly have not. But it's one of continuing to pray, but also of saying, what can I do? So we're not just in, you know, back to my point and Christina's point about doing justice. And it's about, God, what do you want me to do? And it's not a total passive, I'm just kind of here waiting. I'm waiting for God to show up, or I'm just waiting to go to heaven. It is, what am I to do right here and now with what you have given me?
Dr. Edmondson, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would echo much of what Sheila said, and also, you know, if the question is coming from someone who is identifies with the Christian traditions specifically, then I would speak to some of the liturgical elements of the Christian tradition, which is both confession and repentance. I believe it was Dr. Carter earlier who talked a little bit about some of the kind of American cultural ethos about individualism, right? And so one of the problems that we are dealing with for people of the Christian tradition is the Christian tradition of faith that comes from the Eastern world, juxtaposed with highly individualistic practices. And so the idea of corporate repentance and corporate lament and corporate confession and corporate restitution and corporate repair are things that are foundational to the historical Christian tradition. However, what we have in the United States is that everyone's faith tradition is impacted by its cultural context. They tend to dance together. And so what we have in the United States is a Christianity, and I'm saying that as a sociological statement, Christianity as like not a spiritual entity, but the social idea of a religion, Christianity, was shaped in the midst of genocide and enslavement. And so, and it was shaped by people who held to the belief that they were pious while also dominating other people. So that's a deep contradiction. And there are entire strands and trajectories of the Christian American tradition that till today uphold people who enslaved other human beings, and even more specifically enslaved people who were their fellow Christians. So all of that muck, all that junk has to be exposed. And from the Christian tradition, we do that by shining light on it, not by hiding it. And theologically speaking, we don't see that sin goes away with time. Sin doesn't even get better with time. So although from a Western perspective, we believe in inevitable progress, that over time things just get better. That's in contradiction of historical Christianity. So it has to be uprooted, it has to be exposed, it has to be dealt with. And I would say that there are practices within that particular religious tradition and others about corporate confession, repentance, about discipline, church discipline, that allows us to have conversations about the sin of racism, and to think about it in theological terms as well as sociological terms.
Jenny, one more question, please.
So this next question is directed towards Dr. Denetdale. In light of what has been said today, there may still be those who prefer to keep the status quo and remain silent. Is silence a form of violence?
Okay. That's a really interesting question. I've had these conversations with many people, particularly Indigenous women, Indigenous people who've been traumatized by the boarding school experience, by women, even men who've been sexually assaulted. And I think that these are very traumatizing things, and there may be, it may not be necessarily that everybody needs to come forward and speak their truth. We see the repercussions of people who speak publicly and what happens to them. And so I think that it can have different meanings, and that it's not necessarily that everybody needs to, be public about it, but that we work all in different ways to support and to create a network of community where we support each other, help each other, and work towards spaces of, and I like to think about it as momentarily places to revitalize ourselves. I don't think that, as one of the questions pointed out in the question and answer, they asked about how can we heal, I think is the question, from racism when racism's still here. And I like to think about it in terms of the spaces that you go into, part of your community, your family, your colleagues, whatever network you have, for these moments of respite, for these moments to gather yourself and pull yourself together and revitalize, is how I like to think about it.
Dr. Carter, you often speak of racism as this powerful driver of health inequities. Can you explain your work on racial identity and racism?
I'll make an effort to say a little something about them. So first, racial identity. Racial identity is a psychological concept that was introduced in the 1970s to help us understand the transformation that occurred during the civil rights movement of a people. And individual psychologists began to describe how what they were seeing as a metamorphosis of people who were colored or Negro became Black and proud. That was an amazing metamorphosis that happened between 1950 and 1970. So psychologists started to study this in individuals and began to document what we now call racial identity statuses. That is, each person who's a member of a racial group, regardless of the group, has a way that they understand the meaning of that group membership for himself or herself and for others. That's racial identity. Then the theories say that people vary, and and the way in which they understand their racial group membership. And that variation has particular meaning. So if you have a Black person, doesn't mean that you have a Black identified person. It means, and we know we have other terms that we use to describe people who may look like one thing on the outside and reflect something else on the inside. I won't repeat those terms, but I think we all know what I'm talking about. That's racial identity. And what the research of the last 40 years have shown is that it matters how you understand yourself as a racial being in terms of how you act, how you behave, what you think matters, etc. What we also are beginning to understand in relationship to race-based traumatic stress, and let me just clarify, race-based traumatic stress is not post-traumatic stress disorder that's described in the mental health literature as being trauma. We describe race-based traumatic stress as a psychological and emotional injury, that someone who has had a racial encounter has been injured emotionally and psychologically as a consequence of that encounter, which is distinctly different from describing trauma as a mental health disorder, which places the issues internal to the person. We take a different position and say race and racism are not things that are necessarily fully internal, but rather are external, and create insults and wounds and injuries to people. And the importance of the designation of injury is that in our legal system, if you are injured by another party, you have the right to seek damages and redress for that injury. If you have a mental disorder, you don't really have any recourse. If you said someone made me sick, well, they'll try to heal you, but that's about it. Injury puts things in a different category. So I lost my train of thought. So I was trying to connect racial identity and race-based traumatic stress. And what was the question? I'm sorry.
So if you could just explain your work, you got it.
Okay, then I've done that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Carter. That is fascinating and interesting at the exact same time. And as you explain that, I want to go back to Dr. Denetdale to talk about this historical trauma, stressors, what you're seeing with the Navajo Nation, and what should be done to move towards healing and solutions, and what can we do as everyday citizens? Do you have any suggestions for us, Dr. Denetdale?
Well, let me say that right now there are pockets on the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation covers, is in the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and southern Utah. And we are seeing our infection rates with the coronavirus have surpassed all of the states' infection rates. We have a high number of people who've died from the rates as well. And our leaders, scholars have connected that to the historic disparities with which our people live. And so, you know, it's been a really hard 3 months of watching. I don't know that there is one Dene who has not seen a relative who's died from COVID, and the same is true for me. In the work that I do, this evening, I will be offering introductory remarks for the first online Dene Pride event. That happens every month in June, and it had been on the Navajo Nation. It'd been very difficult for the Navajo Nation to acknowledge the gender variation. And so in the last maybe 10 years, we've seen more acceptance of people who identify beyond the gender binaries. And so I'll be introducing the guest speakers this evening at 6 o'clock. And I'm really proud to be an ally of our LGBTQI relatives, but also to be acknowledged that this is part of the scholarship that I've done. And so I'm also involved, and I listen very carefully to what our young people are doing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, our Indigenous people. They're mostly young people who are doing this work on the ground and participating in speaking out and acting out against police violence, for example. And I have to say that one of the things that happens in struggle is that we are once again revitalized. We are once again in struggle, create a sense of community and a sense of togetherness. And that is what I find one of the most vital things of the present.
Community and togetherness. Jenny, I want to come back to you because I see that we have lots of questions. So can you share a few more of the audience's questions with our panel?
Yes, this one is to Dr. Carter. To follow what you were just sharing, historically, some ethnic groups that have been oppressed, Native American, Japanese, and others, what do you think it says about America that ignores an attempt at restitution to the African Americans who never received even the 40 acres and a mule?
What does it say? I think it's, so from my perspective, I think it's the relationship between Black people and white Americans is distinctly different than the relationship between the Native Americans and Japanese Americans and other groups who are indigenous to the country. And our level of intimacy, I think, speaks to the struggle that Blacks and whites have with respect to relating to one another. It's a little different when you are in the house and you care for the people who are oppressing you. And so the perspective that Black people have with respect to interacting with whites is far more intimate and therefore more scary, I think, for whites. And it's been way more difficult to accept and acknowledge what's happened in that relationship than it has been in the relationship with other groups. So with the Japanese Americans, for instance, that was very time limited oppression, not to say that they were not subject to discrimination, they were, or is time limited. And with respect to Native people, the nature of the relationship between them and whites is different because they're sovereign people. And so that creates a different dynamic. The oppression and discrimination is no less horrendous, but the relationship between members of the groups are different. And I think that is what speaks to the fact that there's more difficulty on the part of whites to acknowledge A, what happened, B, that it continues. And the way we know it continues is in the differences in life outcomes. When you look at the experiences, even with COVID, for instance, the outcomes that accrue to Black people are distinctly different than those are for whites, and the same thing for Native people or Latinos. So when we have disparate outcomes, that tells us that indicates and shows us the presence of racial differences, that people are being treated on the basis of race, and that subjects them to greater harm or greater injury or greater illness or greater suffering. And I think it's hard to acknowledge that and to own it, because as a society, there's been little investment in owning the experiences of the group, and there's only been references to individual behavior. And I think that's where we get trapped, by talking about this from an individualist perspective versus from a group or system perspective.
Do you have one more question for us, Jenny, from the audience?
Yes, this one is for Ms. Sheila. The question is, how are we supposed to bring about racial healing when the effects of racism continue to happen?
You know what, when I think about racial healing, you mean, is she talking about between groups? Is that what she's referring to?
Like it is a personal racial healing.
Okay. So how do we do that in light of the fact that it's continuing to happen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it really is an ongoing work because it hasn't stopped. It continues. And so when I had referenced before about the need for soul care and really being intentional about what we need in order to continue to survive and thrive in this climate, there has to be an intentionality about it. There has to be a sense of community. We can't do this alone. So some of the conversations around community, absolutely, and moving away from this kind of individualistic perspective, that's really essential. And I think when I look back over time, and I know for me growing up in the late 60s, early 70s, and just being a part of a community, and in which there was community support, and that's happening, but we need more of that. We need more of just a collective sense of that we are here to support one another, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in the schools, that we cannot continue to kind of rely on or hope that they're going to get it, because they, to a certain degree, we're seeing change and we're seeing inroads, and there are places where people are really doing the work and they really are looking at the implicit and explicit biases, whether it's in a workplace or a school setting, but that is not going to generally be the case. And so we can't just kind of relax into this and believe that even though we have a measure of having dealt with the trauma that we've carried from the past, there are going to be things that will happen. And we've got to have like a soul care plan in terms of how are we going to support ourselves and our families and our communities.
Thank you for that. I think there's one more question from Ms. Martha. It reads, how do we raise the level of awareness on historical wrongs without escalating violence and hatred? Dr. Edmondson.
Yeah, I can do my best to give that a try. So, I, along with, I think many people would make the case that racial stratification, obviously it's maintained through ideology and policy and systems, but also violence and the threat of violence. This is why, post-emancipation in the United States, we had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. We had thousands of lynchings disproportionately impacting people of African descent, but also targeting other groups of color in the United States as well. So when we talk about dealing with racism, I think we also have to have an honest conversation about the way in which racism itself is violent, and it's maintained through violence and the threat of violence. So if the question is, how do we talk about it without there being more violence? I would say that the violence is already here. It's transformed in some ways, the way in which the violence is expressed and what hands are demonstrating the violence. But we could argue that poor people of color in Flint who experienced lead in their water for years without intervention was a violence to the body. We could argue that the environmental racism that poor communities and indigenous communities experience is a violence. It is a violence to the body. And I would say that not talking about it, not talking about the history of it, not being honest about it allows the perpetuation of violence to continue. Because whether we see it or not, that's what's maintaining it. So when we think about even the more recent tragic and painful images of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, those are the examples of literal violence taking a life, but we also have the kind of psychological shaping that now we have people who look like those individuals and who love individuals who look like Ahmaud and love individuals who look like George, who are part of their family at their dinner table. That the violence that they experience becomes a sort of psychological terrorism. So what we must do is be honest about the history and the reality so that violence can end, because the violence is taking place whether we want to call it that or not.
Thank you, Dr. Edmondson. Thank you, Jenny, and thank you to our audience for those thought-provoking and amazing questions. Those were very good. Before we go to our final question, we would like to share one last video with you today. And then I want to note that the last young person that you see, Courtney Robertson with Everyday Black Girl, she's actually from Nacogdoches County, and that county is on the call with us today. And again, what you see or hear may be disturbing, so if you need to walk away from your device, you can do so now. So let's watch the last video.
I feel an animosity that I've never felt before. You dirty Chinese. And he just kept saying that over and over again. I've never felt anything like this before.
Just a few months ago, working at Thirsty Line, this new restaurant that we have over in it's right up the street in Euless. Gave a customer his appetizer. He replied, he said, "Thanks, nigger." And it caught me off guard. But it's just the world we live in. I was jogging around the neighborhood, went up the street, and there's a lot of other people around me walking, jogging, doing the same thing. They're just all white, and I was the only black one. Then the officer came. He just pulled up, stopped me, asked if I was doing anything illegal. Said no. Why was I jogging? I was just jogging. I don't know why he thought I was doing something wrong. Didn't say anything to all the other people around me. Like, they were white, so I mean, I don't know.
I remember a day when we were helping, I think my family move into a house out in this area, and we had a beat up truck from moving things, and we were all sweaty. We had a cut off shirt and some shorts on, whatever the case was. But I remember being stopped by the police. We were stopped by the police, and I didn't have my wallet on me because we had been moving, and I think we just ran to the store. I can't remember, but I remember being stopped by the police and him asking where we lived and what we were doing in the neighborhood and what was going on and why we were driving the truck and whose truck was it. And we're giving him all these answers. And then I remember being asked to step out of the car. And I asked the police officer why. And he couldn't give me a reason and this and that. And I remember calling my dad so infuriated because we had done nothing wrong.
The recent events that have happened with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and so on and so forth have impacted me mentally and emotionally. I've had to disconnect a couple times, but despite all of that, I still went out and protested 2 times the other week, and I've been using my platform and spreading awareness, especially when it comes to the lives of Black women, because oftentimes our stories are being erased by the media, especially when it comes to police brutality and racism, sexism, all that contributes to our experience. So that's been the main thing I've been pushing. And on top of that, I've been using my platform to have informational conversations with like-minded individuals, with young people within my generation, just spreading awareness and educating the masses any way that we can.
So we have just 2 final questions for our panelists, and Everyday Black Girls platform, that is actually Courtney Roberts, not Courtney Robertson. So I want to correct that for us before we move on. But 2 final questions for our panel. So you just saw the youth youth in general have been at the forefront of the social justice movement. So could each of you just finish this sentence? When I look at our youth today, I see, and Ms. Sheila, can you start?
Definitely, I see there's a fearlessness, there's a passion, and in many ways it really is inspiring. So it certainly inspires me, as someone who grew up in the late 60s, 70s, and just to see just that passion. And I think also because it's diverse, it's exciting to see. I'm hopeful, and yet I'm a little bit, you know, I'm going to hold back a little bit until I see what does it actually translate into. But I do see a lot of passion, and that actually inspires me as an older person to want to get back in there again, because there are ways in which I think for people from my generation, as well as other generations, where we become cynical, and there have been places where we've just felt hopeless, like nothing's going to ever change. And so to see these young people go out in droves, and it's actually starting to shift. Laws are being passed. Narratives are being challenged. It's pretty remarkable to see.
Thank you. Dr. Denetdale, when I look at our youth today, I see.
When I look at our youth today, I see an incredible fierceness. I'm so proud of them. And I think about how they are the warriors who carry on the knowledge of our ancestors, and that what they're doing on the streets comes at great cost, and that in the 70s we benefited from our communities who were fierce and stood on the front lines, and we should never forget that sacrifice. And then the other thing is that I see a great thirst to learn.
Dr. Edmondson.
You know, I think when I look at our youth, and to be honest with you, I think it depends on what age range we're talking about. But if it's the people that I work with typically, which is traditional college age students, when I see them, I see a debt that I owe them. I see a debt that Generation X boomers that owes them. And I say that because there are problems that they have inherited because we didn't finish what we started, or because we were comfortable within, for some cases, by middle class identity, or in the spaces where we work. And so when I see them, I see my teaching as what is due to them. I see, if they will have it, my mentorship, what is due to them. Because I do feel a sense of a burden that they are experiencing and trying to figure their way around. That was handed to them by the unfinished business. And every generation does this. And I think instead of reflecting on the critiques of the younger generation, which is, that they don't listen to guidance, or they're too zealous, I think I would rather look at myself and say, what is it that I owe them in terms of mentorship, and in terms of supporting them as they uphold kind of this banner of activism at this point.
Dr. Carter?
I agree with the other panelists. I also experience pride. I'm proud of them. And I feel more hopeful that the issues that we've been struggling with for decades and decades to bring to the surface may eventually, someday, find the light.
So today's topic has been heavy, but vital to address. So this is our final question. What are you doing to dismantle racial trauma and historical trauma in your personal work? And what words of hope can you leave with our audience today? Dr. Carter.
I'm trying to get a way to fight back established and used. So race-based traumatic stress injury is both a mental health and a legal strategy, and I'm trying to get that established because we've lost the gains that we had from the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Almost all of those laws have been decimated and turned to be impotent. And so I'm trying to build a new mental health and legal strategy to redress racism.
Dr. Edmondson.
Yeah, so on a very practical level, for about the last year, I've tried to work out. And as someone who doesn't like to work out at all, I've not yet become the person that's like, I got to work out today. That has not happened. I've tried to work out. It also reminds me that I do have a sense of agency, and I do care for myself. It's also a great stress reliever. So that's one practical thing. And also practicing community, being around other people who are also committed to the same things for a variety of reasons, whether it's their faith tradition or their academic understanding or their heritage. But being in fellowship with different people and trying to use whatever skills and gifts I have for good, and networking and working with others to make practical change, to find some quick wins. I mean, we're talking about a long-term battle, a long-term brokenness in the United States, but I try to find things that feel like quick wins as fuel to help us to continue to move forward.
Dr. Denetdale.
I'm, as the chair of the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission, one of the things that I'm working on right now is a funerary studies report, because our people have become very much immersed in funeral and burial services that are very Western and Christian, and many of us have forgotten that we have traditional thought and traditional practices. And so for me to actively be a part of remembering traditional knowledge from our elders is very inspiring to me, and particularly on this topic, which is very something that we don't talk about. And so that's been something I'm working on as part of my contribution to my nation and to my people. And the second thing is that my late father was a healer. And there's things that I keep for myself in terms of traditional thought and spiritually keeping myself stable and uplifting. And so there's some things that you just keep for yourself, that you don't tell other people or you don't share except for close relatives. And so those are the two things that I would like to leave, to say that, we have things that we keep for ourselves that inspire us and revitalize us all the time.
And Ms. Sheila.
Since the beginning of the year and just having my book come out, Healing Racial Trauma, Road to Resilience, there's been lots of conversation, lots of opportunities to share individually as well as corporately, and in many settings, secular settings, Christian settings, and really helping people to stop and look at what are we carrying. And I think that a lot of the conversation, even right now, and people running and buying books, and everyone is talking about, reconciliation, and but not to miss the fact that there's trauma that we're carrying and the need for that, to heal from that. And so a lot of my time and energies are spent in that space. And it's been wonderful just to get feedback from people in terms of they're feeling met in that space, and the fact that the focus is really Black and Indigenous and other people of color, and the realities of where the places of intersectionality, and so just encouraging us as a group that we all need to get on the same page. We've got to look at our own, whether it's biases we have against one another, whether it's out and out racism, and even where inherently we're looking at even at ourselves, and how we have a very white and Western view. And so I'm encouraged by that, and in terms of the work that I'm doing on a personal level, when I talk about soul care like that, like Christina was talking about exercising, like I really taken that seriously, like, in the midst of this, like so many activists are burning out and not wanting to be one of those casualties, and knowing that I could easily be. I'm really intentional about what are the things that I need to have in my life that will give me the short wins, as Christina said, but also in the long haul to be able to walk this out.
We just want to thank each of you again for just sharing your wisdom and insight with us today. For the audience, I know we weren't able to get to all of your questions, but we will send those questions to our panel and post their answers to our website as well as our Facebook page by Wednesday, July 1. And with that, Sherry, I'll turn it back over to you for final remarks.
Wow, thank you, Angela, for a great panel discussion. This has been truly amazing, and I was just reading some of the comments from the chats and the chat box, and one of the people said, you know, I want to be about healing one person at a time. And that's really what this is all about. We recognize that racial trauma is real, it's very emotionally charged, as Angela has said, to discuss. And we recognize that sometimes we need that place for healing. And if you need a behavioral health support, you can go to our website, Alliance for Greater Works, or alliancetx.org, and complete the contact form requesting behavioral health resources. We are happy to share our list of culturally competent behavioral health providers. Also, Alliance will be offering a free Healing Youth course, and it is offered in 3 90-minute sessions on July 16th, the 23rd, and the 30th from 11:30 to 1. You must attend all 3 sessions. This course teaches educators, pastors, parents, young adults to recognize the signs of trauma in youth and empowers them to respond in ways that will begin to create a pathway to healing. And so that's what we're about. We're really about just supporting people to know that we are standing with you, and we want all of us to be whole and well. We want you to know that you are not alone in this fight for human equity. Alliance is committed to standing shoulder to shoulder with you to dismantle the root causes of injustices affecting people of color. And ladies and gentlemen, in this generation, we believe that we will see restorative justice. When we look at our youth and we look at the things that we're seeing today, we believe that we will see restorative justice. Again, thanks to the Hogg Foundation for Mental Health and the 5 counties that we're working with, Bastrop, Brooks, Morris, Nacogdoches, and Victoria. They're doing great work in their counties to create systems level change. And we also have prepared a toolkit called Dismantling Racial Trauma to provide next steps that you can take as an individual or in a community. Go to our website, alliancetx.org. It's on the front page. You can just scroll down a little bit and you'll see it, and just download that document and share it with others. It's also an article in there that the team of Alliance wrote that I think is really good, that just sharing some of their concerns and things that they've recognized over the last several weeks and months. So thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next virtual conversation. We're planning one for August, and we will keep you posted on the actual date. So thank you again for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you real soon. Take care and stay safe.